He had $11 billion of infrastructure between him and any threat that could ever reach him. Armored cars, men who would die before letting a bullet find him. An aim that made grown criminals lower their eyes. And on a rainy Tuesday night in November, Damon Ashe traded all of it for a rusted bicycle, a torn windbreaker, and a phone that kept dying because he'd bought the cheapest charger in the drugstore. He wanted to know exactly one thing: whether a single person left in this city could still look at him and see a man, not a fortune. He found his answer behind the counter of a 24-hour diner on the edge of a neighborhood his own organization had never bothered to touch, because there was nothing there worth stealing. Damon Ashe was 35 years old, and he had run the largest criminal syndicate on the Great Lakes for 9 of them. He had inherited it the way men in his world usually did, through blood and through blood spilled, taking control after his father was gunned down outside a restaurant that still, to this day, kept his father's favorite table permanently reserved. Damon had spent the years since building something colder, cleaner, and considerably more profitable than what his father had left behind: shipping routes that moved more than cargo, a real estate portfolio that laundered money as efficiently as it generated it, and a reputation so absolute that most of his enemies preferred quiet negotiation to open war. He was, by any external measure, exactly what every ambitious woman in the city wanted. He knew this because they told him, in every register from breathless to businesslike, at every gala, every private dinner, every carefully engineered introduction his associates kept arranging in the hope of tying his empire to theirs through marriage. He had dated, if the word even applied, a rotating cast of beautiful, accomplished, entirely interchangeable women who complimented his watch before they ever asked his name, who laughed at things he hadn't said, were funny, who touched his arm at exactly the moment their handlers had coached them to. He had stopped being able to tell, somewhere around year 6, whether anyone in his orbit wanted him or simply wanted access to him. The two things had become so thoroughly tangled that he'd quietly given up trying to separate them, and the giving up had calcified into something that looked, from the outside, exactly like the cold, unbothered detachment his reputation already assumed of him. It was his cousin Reyes, his second in command, the only person left alive who'd known him before any of this. Back when they were teenagers sneaking into ball games they couldn't afford tickets for, who finally said the thing nobody else would. "You don't know what it feels like anymore," Reyes told him one night, the two of them the only ones left in Damon's office long after a gala had emptied out, "to have someone want you for nothing. You've built a life where that's not possible to test. Nobody's going to tell you the truth when the truth could get them killed for disappointing you." "And what would you have me do about that?" Damon had said, more tired than defensive. "Disappear for a while," Reyes said. "Not the estate. Not a resort under an alias where the staff already know who signs the checks. Actually disappear. Become nobody. See what nobody gets treated like, and see who treats him decently anyway." It was, Damon would think later, either the best advice his cousin had ever given him or the single most reckless, and for 3 weeks he dismissed it entirely, until a Tuesday in November when a business dinner ended with a woman he'd known for exactly 90 minutes suggesting, with a straight face, that his charitable foundation ought to be named after her instead of his late mother, and something in him finally, quietly, broke loose from its moorings. He called Reyes that same night. "Set it up," he said. 2 weeks. "Nobody knows but you. If anything happens to the organization while I'm gone, you handle it exactly the way I would." "And if something happens to you?" Reyes asked. "Then I suppose I'll have found out the hard way that the world really is as bad as I think it is," Damon said. "Set it up." Reyes built the cover with the same meticulous care he brought to everything, a fake identity clean enough to survive a background check. A studio apartment above a laundromat in a neighborhood Damon had genuinely never set foot in, a bicycle, and a delivery app account under the name Danny Cole. No armed guards, no car, no money beyond what the job itself would pay, deposited weekly into an account with a starting balance of exactly $40, because Reyes had insisted, over Damon's objections, that a man who could always fall back on hidden reserves wasn't actually testing anything. "If you know you can quit whenever it gets uncomfortable," Reyes said, "you'll never actually feel what it feels like not to be able to. Live it for real or don't bother." Damon lived it for real. The first week nearly broke him in ways his entire violent career never had. He learned what it meant to stand in the rain for 40 minutes outside a restaurant because an order was running late, and the manager didn't care that the delivery driver waiting on the curb was getting soaked. He learned what it meant to have a customer open the door, look at his windbreaker and his cheap bicycle, and speak to him the way people speak to furniture. No eye contact, no thank you, door closed before he'd even turned around. He learned what an empty stomach actually felt like on a night when the app's payout hadn't cleared and his account showed $6 and change, not the abstraction of frugality he'd occasionally performed at charity events, but real, gnawing hunger that made him understand, for the first time in his adult life, exactly how much of his empire had been built on never once having to feel this. He ate at the same diner most nights during his shift, the Lakeview, a 24-hour place 2 blocks from his fake apartment, chosen because it was cheap and because the coffee, against all odds, was actually good. It was there, on his 4th night as Danny Cole, that he first noticed Sadie Coleman. Sadie worked the overnight counter most weeknights, a job she'd taken specifically for the shift differential, because the extra $2 an hour made the difference between covering her daughter's asthma medication and not. She was 29, sharp-eyed, quick with a joke that landed exactly hard enough to diffuse a rude customer without escalating him, and entirely unimpressed by anyone who walked through the diner's door acting like the world owed them anything. Damon, Danny, in every interaction that mattered now, noticed her the way he noticed very little else in this new, stripped-down life. She treated everyone exactly the same. The construction workers who came in still filthy from a shift, the elderly regular who ordered the same plate every night and always shortchanged the tip by exactly $1, the exhausted delivery drivers who came in just to use the bathroom and warm up for 10 minutes without buying anything. Sadie gave all of them the same unhurried attention, the same small kindnesses that cost her nothing but clearly came from somewhere real. The first time she spoke to him directly, he was sitting at the counter counting out change for a cup of coffee he genuinely wasn't sure he could afford, his soaked windbreaker dripping onto the stool beside him. His face, doing whatever exhausted men's faces do when they're doing math they don't want to be doing. "You look like you had a night," Sadie said, sliding a mug in front of him before he'd finished counting. "Bad enough that the tip barely covered the app's cut," Damon admitted, the honesty coming easier than he expected. Maybe because nothing about this exchange could touch anything that actually mattered to him. "Sorry, I'm still counting for the coffee. Give me a second." "Coffee's on the house tonight," Sadie said, already turning to grab the pot for a refill 2 seats down. "Slow night. Kitchen made too much of the soup special and it's going to waste anyway. You want a bowl?" "I can't pay for." "I didn't ask if you could pay," Sadie said, not unkindly, already dishing it up before he'd finished the sentence. "I asked if you wanted it." Different question. He ate the soup. It was, without exaggeration, the best thing he had eaten in 9 years, not because of the quality. It was diner soup, serviceable and nothing more, but because it was the first meal in longer than he could remember that had been given to him with absolutely nothing attached to it. No favor being cultivated, no access being sought, no calculation at all, as far as he could tell, beyond the simple fact that a tired-looking man had walked in soaked and hungry, and she'd had soup that would otherwise be thrown out. "Thank you," he said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised him. "Don't mention it," Sadie said, already moving down the counter to the next customer. "Come back when it's raining again. We're always throwing something out." He came back the next night, and the one after that. Over the following 2 weeks, a rhythm built itself without either of them quite naming it. Danny Cole finishing his shift around midnight, sliding into the same stool at the counter. Sadie sliding him whatever the kitchen had extra of that night, the two of them talking through the dead hours when the diner was nearly empty, and the only sound was the hum of the refrigerated case, and the occasional bell over the door. He learned about her daughter, Mia, 6 years old, sharp as a tack, according to her mother, currently obsessed with a cartoon about a family of otters that Sadie had, through sheer repetition, come to hate with a passion she found genuinely funny to complain about. He learned that Sadie's husband had left when Mia was 2, not dramatically, just quietly, the way some men simply stop showing up for their own lives, and that Sadie had spent 4 years since building a life for her daughter out of double shifts and careful budgeting, and a stubbornness Damon found himself admiring more with every conversation. He never once, in 2 weeks, told her a lie he could avoid telling. He told her his name was Danny. He told her he did delivery work, which was true. He let her assume, without correcting it, that he was simply broke, because in the strictest sense of the apartment he was living in, and the balance in the account he was using, he was. Every other detail he gave her was true. His opinions, his sense of humor, the things that actually made him laugh rather than the things he performed laughing at. The specific, unguarded honesty of a man who had, for 2 weeks, been given the extraordinary gift of being spoken to like he mattered for reasons that had nothing to do with power. "You're different from most of the guys who come through here," Sadie told him one night, about 10 days in, refilling his coffee without being asked, the way she'd started doing automatically. Most people who've had a hard run get either mean or invisible. You're neither. Maybe I just haven't had a hard enough run yet, Damon said, only half joking. Maybe, Sadie said, studying him with the particular directness he'd come to associate specifically with her. Or maybe you're one of the rare ones who doesn't let hard turn him bitter. Those are worth keeping around, Danny. I'd hold on to whatever's keeping you decent. He thought about that sentence for days afterward, turning it over the way he'd once turned over financial statements, looking for the angle, the leverage, the thing she wanted from saying it, and finding every time nothing. It had simply been true, as far as she knew it, offered without calculation, and it settled into him with a weight that 9 years of women complimenting his watch had never once come close to producing. The test he'd set for the world, without ever telling Sadie she was being tested, came to its sharpest point on the 11th night, when a man named Roy, a semi-regular customer with a temper the staff had learned to navigate carefully, came in already drunk, already loud, and decided somewhere in his third beer that the exhausted-looking delivery driver sitting quietly at the counter made an easy target. "The hell you looking at?" Roy said, loud enough to turn heads, shoving against Damon's shoulder hard enough to nearly knock the coffee out of his hand. "You delivery boys think you can just sit here taking up space all night?" Damon had killed men for less than the shove. He had, in another life entirely, ended careers, and occasionally lives over disrespect delivered with a fraction of Roy's volume. But Danny Cole had no organization behind him, no armed men outside, nothing but the specific, deliberate restraint he'd been practicing for 11 days, the restraint of a man choosing, on purpose, to find out what happened when he had absolutely no power to fall back on. "Didn't mean to bother you," Damon said evenly, sliding his stool a few inches down the counter. "Just getting some coffee." "Yeah, well, get it somewhere else," Roy said, stepping closer, clearly spoiling for the reaction he wasn't getting. Sadie was around the counter before Damon had finished his sentence, planting herself between Roy and the stool with a directness that made Roy blink in surprise. "Roy," she said, her voice carrying a flat, absolute authority that Damon had never heard her use before. "You're going to sit back down, or you're going to leave. And either way, you're not putting your hands on my customers again. I mean it." "He's a delivery boy, Sadie, not exactly customer of the month. He's a person sitting at my counter minding his own business," Sadie cut in. "And I don't care if he tips $1 or 100. That doesn't change how he gets treated in here. You want to keep drinking, keep your hands to yourself. You want to keep shoving people, there's a diner 3 blocks down that'll put up with you." "This one won't." Roy muttered something under his breath, but he backed off, dropping back onto his own stool with the particular sullen deflation of a man who'd expected an easy target and gotten a wall instead. Sadie stood there another moment, making sure the situation had actually settled, before turning back to Damon, her expression softening instantly. "You okay?" she asked. "I'm fine," Damon said, and found, to his own quiet astonishment, that his hands were faintly unsteady, not from fear. He had never once in his adult life been afraid of a man like Roy, but from something entirely unfamiliar, the specific, disorienting experience of being defended by someone with absolutely nothing to gain from doing it. "Some people think because you're doing gig work at midnight you don't deserve basic manners," Sadie said, refilling his coffee with hands that were, he noticed, remarkably steady. "I don't run my counter that way. Everybody who sits here gets treated like a person, doesn't matter what they've got in their pocket." Damon looked at her. This tired, sharp-eyed, entirely unglamorous woman who worked overnight shifts for a shift differential to cover her daughter's medication, who had just stood between him and a drunk stranger without a single second of hesitation, who had spent 2 weeks giving him free soup and honest conversation, and absolutely nothing in return except the simple conviction that people deserved decency regardless of what they could offer her, and understood, with a clarity that arrived less like a realization and more like a verdict, that he had found exactly what he'd left his entire empire behind to look for. He realized, already in love with her. It had happened somewhere in the last 2 weeks without him noticing the exact moment. The way genuine things tend to arrive quietly, while a person is busy watching for something more dramatic. He should have told her the truth that night. He knew it even as he didn't. But the fear that stopped him wasn't complicated or strategic. It was simply the fear of a man who had, for the first time in nearly a decade, found someone who looked at him and saw a person rather than a fortune, and who couldn't yet bring himself to risk finding out whether that would survive the truth of exactly how large the fortune actually was. He got 2 more weeks than he'd planned, because Reyes, when Damon called to check in, told him the organization was running smoothly enough that there was no urgent reason to come back yet. A small mercy that let Damon extend the only honest relationship he'd built in years for a little while longer before reality inevitably came looking for him. It came looking for him on a Thursday night, in the worst possible way. Marcus Vale had been circling Damon's territory for the better part of a year, testing borders the way a patient predator tests fences, looking for the exact spot where the wire had gone slack. Vale ran a smaller but considerably more reckless operation on the city's east side, and he had spent months quietly cultivating a source inside Damon's organization, a mid-level lieutenant named Franco who'd grown tired of watching other men rise faster than him and had decided, in the particular way ambitious mediocrity sometimes curdles into betrayal, that his loyalty could be sold to whoever offered the better price. Franco didn't know where Damon actually was during his 2-week disappearance. Reyes had kept that secret with the same absolute discipline he brought to everything, but he knew enough to notice that Damon had vanished from every public appearance, every scheduled meeting, every place a man in his position was ordinarily expected to be seen, and he knew enough to sell that information to Vale as exactly the opportunity it appeared to be. Ashe is gone. Nobody knows where. If you can find him before Reyes does damage control, you can either eliminate him clean or use whatever he's doing to embarrass him permanently. Either way, the organization's vulnerable while he's off the board. Vale's people were good. Not as good as Damon's, but good enough, with enough resources thrown at the problem, to trace the pattern Damon had tried to keep invisible. A delivery app account activated the same week Damon disappeared, tied to a burner identity that used payment infrastructure with just enough overlap to a shell account Reyes had used before, if you knew exactly where to look and had the patience to look there. It took Vale's people 10 days to find the thread and 3 more to pull it all the way to a studio apartment above a laundromat and a diner 2 blocks away where the same account holder had eaten dinner nearly every night for 2 weeks running. They didn't move on Damon directly. Vale was smarter than that, and considerably more patient. He wanted leverage, not a body. A body invited retaliation from an organization that would, disguise or not, eventually reorganize itself and come looking for revenge with everything Damon had built behind it. Leverage, on the other hand, could be used to negotiate territory without ever risking open war. So Vale's men took Sadie instead. Damon found out the way he found out about everything that mattered now, not through his network of informants, which had no idea he was even in the city, but through a frantic, half-coherent phone call from the diner's night manager, who had his number from a shift swap request weeks earlier and didn't know who else to call. "Danny, it's Frank from the diner. Sadie never showed for her shift and she's not answering. And her neighbor said 2 guys, in suits, took her right off her front steps an hour ago, dragged her into a black car. I called the cops, but they're saying there's nothing to go on yet. I don't know what to..." Damon didn't hear the rest of the sentence. Something in him that had spent 2 weeks carefully, deliberately powerless snapped back online with a violence that surprised even him, and Danny Cole ceased to exist in the space of a single ragged breath. "Where's her daughter?" Damon said, his voice already carrying an authority Frank had never heard from him before. "With Sadie's sister, I think. She wasn't taken, just Sadie." "Good. Keep it that way. Don't tell anyone anything else about tonight. I'm handling it." He called Reyes from the sidewalk outside the diner, rain soaking through the same cheap windbreaker he'd worn for 2 weeks, his hands steady now in a way they hadn't been in the diner 11 nights earlier. Steady, with the specific cold clarity of a man returning fully to a version of himself he'd tried, briefly, to set aside. "I need everything right now," Damon said the moment Reyes picked up. "Full mobilization. Someone found me. They took a woman I've been seeing under the Danny Cole identity, and I need her location before anything else happens to her." "Damon, how long has this been?" "Later," Damon said. "Right now I need Vale's known properties. I need eyes on every one of them within the hour, and I need my car." I need my car." It took Reyes's people 90 minutes to confirm what Damon already suspected. Vale, the lieutenant, Franco, cracked within 20 minutes of Reyes's men finding him at his usual bar, giving up the entire arrangement the moment he understood exactly how thoroughly he'd underestimated the cost of betting against Damon Ashe. Sadie, according to the last confirmed sighting, had been taken to a warehouse Vale's organization used for overflow storage on the industrial edge of the east side. Unglamorous, defensible, exactly the kind of place a patient man chose when he wanted leverage kept quiet, rather than paraded. Damon arrived in his actual car for the first time in 2 weeks, dressed in the version of himself that commanded absolute obedience, flanked by 12 men who had spent the entire drive being briefed on exactly how much this mattered to him. A level of personal investment from their boss that none of them had ever witnessed before, and that made them, if anything, more careful rather than less. They breached the warehouse from 3 sides simultaneously, Damon's men moving with the disciplined, terrifying efficiency of an organization that had spent 9 years perfecting exactly this kind of operation. Vale's guards, competent but outnumbered and entirely unprepared for the scale of the response, fell back within minutes, several of them wisely choosing surrender over a fight they had no realistic chance of winning. Damon found Sadie in a small office at the back of the warehouse, tied to a chair but otherwise, to his enormous relief, unharmed. Vale had wanted leverage, not a martyr, and had at least been disciplined enough to keep his men from doing anything that couldn't be walked back if negotiations went his way. She looked up when the door burst open, her face a mixture of terror and confusion that shifted, the moment she recognized him, into something far more complicated. "Danny?" Her voice cracked on the word, taking in the tailored coat, the armed men flanking him. The absolute authority radiating off a man she'd known for 2 weeks as a broke delivery driver who couldn't always afford his own coffee. What is this?" "I'll explain everything," Damon said, crossing the room and kneeling to cut the ties binding her wrists, his hands, for the first time all night, less than perfectly steady. "I promise you every word of it, Sadie. But right now I need to get you somewhere safe." You're one of them," Sadie said, understanding arriving in pieces, her voice shaking with the specific vertigo of a person realizing the ground beneath an entire relationship had never been what it appeared. "You're not a delivery driver. My name is Damon Ashe," he said quietly, because she deserved the truth delivered plainly, not softened, not managed the way he managed every other difficult conversation in his life. "I run an organization you've probably heard whispered about and never wanted to know the details of. Everything else I told you was true. My name wasn't. I'm sorry. I'll explain why, but not here." Sadie stared at him, several competing things visible on her face at once: fear, betrayal, the particular disorientation of grief for a version of a person who had, apparently, never fully existed. And Damon braced himself, in the middle of a warehouse full of his own armed men, for the possibility that he had just lost the only genuine thing he'd built in 9 years, regardless of how the rescue itself concluded. "Get me out of here first," Sadie finally said, her voice tight but steady. "Then you're going to explain every single word of the last 2 weeks, and I get to decide what happens after that. Not you." "Fair," Damon said, and meant it completely. They found Marcus Vale in the warehouse's main floor, disarmed and surrounded, his earlier confidence replaced by the particular pale calculation of a man realizing exactly how badly he'd misjudged both the target and the response. Damon crossed the floor toward him with Sadie, wrapped in his coat, safely behind his line of men. "You took something that belongs to no organization, Marcus," Damon said, his voice carrying none of the warmth Sadie had known for 2 weeks and all of the authority that had built his empire. "You didn't touch my territory. You didn't touch my money. You touched a woman who has nothing to do with this world, because you thought it would give you leverage over me. That was a mistake you're not going to get the chance to repeat." "I didn't hurt her," Vale said, some remnant of negotiating instinct still functioning despite the obvious hopelessness of his position. "She's fine, Damon. Look at her. Nothing happened." "You're right," Damon said. "Nothing happened. Which is the only reason you're going to walk out of this warehouse alive tonight instead of the alternative. Your territory is forfeit, effective immediately. Every route, every warehouse, every account gets absorbed into mine by end of week, and you're going to sign whatever paperwork my lawyers put in front of you to make that transition look voluntary to anyone who asks. You have exactly one more mistake left in your entire life, Marcus, and I strongly suggest you never make it." Vale, understanding, with the particular clarity of a man who had run out of options, nodded once, and Damon's men moved to secure the details of a surrender that would, by morning, quietly dismantle the last real threat to his eastern territory without a single further shot fired. Damon turned back to Sadie, who had watched the entire exchange with an expression he couldn't quite read, some mixture of shock at the violence contained beneath everything she thought she'd understood, and something else underneath it that he didn't yet dare name hope. "Let's get you home," he said quietly, "to your daughter. And then, if you're willing, I'll tell you everything." Sadie didn't speak much on the drive to her sister's apartment, where Mia was waiting, and Damon didn't push her, understanding, with a clarity that had nothing to do with strategy for the first time in longer than he could remember, that she needed the silence to process a night that had upended nearly everything she thought she knew. He waited outside in the car while she went in to see her daughter, giving her the space to reassure Mia without an armed convoy of unfamiliar men visible through the window, and when she came back out 20 minutes later, her face had settled into something calmer, though no less guarded. "Talk," she said, sliding back into the passenger seat. All of it. From the beginning. He told her everything. His father, the empire he'd inherited, the 9 years of women who'd wanted his watch before his name, Reyes' suggestion, and his own desperate, half-serious decision to test it. The 2 weeks of Danny Cole that had started as an experiment and ended as the realest thing he'd built in nearly a decade. He told her about the soup she'd given him the first night with absolutely nothing attached to it. About the way she'd stood between him and Roy without a second's hesitation. About the specific, disorienting gift of being spoken to like he mattered for reasons that had nothing to do with power. "I should have told you sooner," he said finally. "I know that. I told myself I was protecting the experiment, protecting the answer I was looking for, but the truth is I was scared. I found something with you that I'd genuinely given up believing still existed. And I was terrified that telling you the truth would end it before I'd had the chance to actually earn it honestly." Sadie was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the rain-streaked window, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the anger he'd braced for. "You lied to me for 2 weeks, she said. "About the single biggest thing there was to lie about. I need you to understand that matters, Damon. Whoever you actually are. I built an opinion of a person who, it turns out, doesn't fully exist." "I know," he said. "I'm not going to argue with that. But," Sadie continued, turning to look at him fully for the first time since the warehouse, "everything else was true. Wasn't it? The way you talked to me, the way you listened, the way you never once, in 2 weeks, made me feel like I was less than you, even when you had every reason in your actual life to believe exactly that. None of that was performance." "None of it," Damon said. "I've performed plenty of things in my life, Sadie. That was never one of them." She studied him for a long moment, the particular directness he'd come to love, finding him even now, in the middle of a night that had broken and remade an entire understanding of who he was. "I'm not going to pretend this is simple," she said finally. "You run something dangerous. My daughter comes first, always. And I need to know exactly what that means before I decide anything about what happens next between us. But the man who sat at my counter for 2 weeks eating free soup and never once looked at me like I was beneath him, I don't think that man was a lie. I think he's actually who you are underneath everything else you've built. And I think that man is worth finding out more about carefully on my terms, if you're willing to do that." "I'm willing to do anything you need," Damon said. And meant every word of it with an intensity that surprised him even now. What followed was not the fast, dramatic romance either of them might once have imagined belonged to a story like theirs. It was slower than that, more careful. Sadie setting the pace entirely, Damon following it without complaint, understanding that trust rebuilt after a lie this large couldn't be rushed regardless of how much he wanted to. He kept the Lakeview Diner in business, permanently. Not as a grand gesture, but quietly, through an anonymous investment that covered a badly needed renovation and gave every employee, including Sadie, a raise that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with the simple recognition that people who worked overnight shifts for shift differentials deserved better than they were getting. He met Mia properly 6 weeks later, introduced not as anything more than a friend of her mother's. Patient enough to let the 6-year-old set her own pace of trust the way her mother had insisted on setting hers, playing the otter cartoon game Mia demanded with a genuine enthusiasm that surprised even him. He told Sadie, slowly, over the following months, the full shape of the world he actually lived in. Not to frighten her, but because she'd asked, directly, for honesty going forward. And he had decided, somewhere in the wreckage of the lie he'd told her, that honesty was the only currency he intended to deal in with her ever again. She asked hard questions. She didn't flinch from the answers, even the ones that were genuinely difficult to hear. And slowly, carefully, she began deciding for herself exactly how much of that world she was willing to let into her life and her daughter's. 6 months after the warehouse, on an evening that had nothing dramatic about it at all. No gunfire, no rescue, just an ordinary dinner in Sadie's small apartment. Mia asleep in the next room, Damon found himself thinking back to the exact sentence that had undone him, months earlier, at a counter in a diner he'd walked into as nobody. "Maybe you're one of the rare ones who doesn't let hard turn him bitter. Those are worth keeping around." "Can I ask you something?" he said, watching her clear the dishes with the same unhurried competence she brought to everything. Always. "That first night, the soup. Would you have given it to me if you'd known who I actually was?" Sadie considered the question with the same careful honesty she brought to everything, setting down the plates to actually look at him. "Probably not," she admitted. "If a man had walked in wearing what you actually own, I'd have assumed he didn't need it, and I'd have been right, strictly speaking. But that's exactly why the version of you I met mattered, Damon. I didn't give you anything because of who you were. I gave it to you because you looked like someone who needed it, and that was true regardless of everything else underneath. I think that's the version of you I actually fell for, not the fortune. The man who was grateful for a bowl of soup he genuinely thought he couldn't pay for. That man is still in here, Damon said quietly. I promise you that. I know, Sadie said, and the certainty in her voice, earned slowly over 6 careful months rather than assumed in a single dramatic night, meant more to him than anything the previous 9 years of his empire had ever managed to offer. I wouldn't still be here if I didn't. He reached for her hand across the small kitchen table. No bodyguards, no armored car outside, no audience calculating the value of the gesture, and she laced her fingers through his the way she had, slowly, deliberately, chosen to over 6 months of him proving, one honest conversation at a time, that the man from the diner counter had never actually been a disguise at all. He had simply been the truth, finally uncovered from underneath 9 years of a fortune that had taught the whole world to see everything except the person actually standing inside it. If Damon and Sadie's slow burn journey from a diner counter to real love had you rooting for them the whole way, smash that like button and let us know in the comments which moment melted your heart the most. Share this with anyone who believes real love finds you when you least expect it, and subscribe for more heartfelt mafia romance stories where the danger is real, but the love is realer.